What if the very land we call ancient was never invited to its own genetic story? For decades, global genome maps, those glowing charts that claim to trace human history, had a strange silence right where India should have been. A region older than the pyramids, richer in languages than all of Europe combined. And yet, in the archives of human ancestry, barely a whisper. Why? It wasn't because the DNA didn't exist, it was because no one looked. India's southern spine, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, the lush edges of the Deccan had carried voices for millennia. Poets, priests, traders, kings. But when the world searched for humanity's roots, South India was treated like a footnote, not absent, just ignored. Until 2025. That year, a quiet revolution began not in a museum, but in a lab. Scientists opened the vaults of 2,762 Indian genomes. Not modern noise, but deep ancestral signals, buried codes, hidden inheritances. And what they found broke every assumption. South India didn't just belong to the story of human migration, it was the story. Because these genes weren't just local. They weren't isolated. They carried fingerprints from mountain passes, desert caravans, even ancient oceanic trade. A biological map of conversations between continents stitched right into the bodies of coastal fishermen and tribal elders. But here's the twist. The silence wasn't random. What if the story wasn't missing? It was erased. Erased by centuries of academic focus on the North. Erased by narratives that privileged invaders over indigenes. By governments, textbooks, and borders that kept the past tightly scripted. South India's DNA wasn't quiet, it was silenced. But bones don't lie. And when they speak, they whisper secrets no king or chronicle ever could. In one tiny fragment, under layers of soil and centuries, they found a strand. A signal so ancient, so unexpected, it cracked open the floor of time. Because this wasn't just about India, it was about someone older. Someone the textbooks forgot. And someone the first Indians may have met in the dark. Someone who was not human. And the genome proves it. Because what scientists uncovered in the bones of South India should not have been there. Not in that volume. Not in that depth. Neanderthal DNA everywhere. Not just fragments, but an archive. Over 90% of all Neanderthal sequences known outside Africa, showing up, glowing in Indian genomes. But that's just the beginning. There's something even rarer, something even older. Denisovan DNA, a ghost lineage, once only found in the freezing caves of Siberia. Now, half of what's left of them, found in India. And nearly 51% of it, unique, unmatched, found nowhere else on Earth. Let that settle. Because the AASI, the ancestral South Indians, were supposed to be cut off. Isolated hunter-gatherers, barely touched by the outside world. Their closest living relatives today? The Andamanese. Seafaring, elusive, untouched. So, how did these isolated first Indians come to carry genetic memories from creatures who vanished 40,000 years ago, thousands of miles away? It means something primal happened here. Something more than migration. We're not looking at random genetic noise. We're looking at encounters face-to-face with beings who weren't entirely us, and weren't entirely gone. South India wasn't just a destination. It was a collision zone. A place where the first humans, fresh from Africa, didn't just walk into emptiness, they walked into shadows. Caves, cliffs, firelit ravines, where they met others. And mated, merged, disappeared into each other. And now, we're only just realizing those strangers left fingerprints inside us. But if the first Indians weren't alone, then who were these archaic ancestors? And why does their DNA still burn brightest in the South? Because one group still carries their mark like a blood tattoo, the Andamanese, and their genome is next door. But just beyond that door, another ghost enters the frame. Not a hunter, not a cousin, but a farmer from a land where seeds had barely begun to fall. Except here's the twist. He brought no crops, In the genetic layers of ancient India beneath the Aasi, before the steppe we find something older than any local harvest. A deep strand of ancestry from the Zagros Mountains of Iran. Not from village dwellers with baskets of grain, but from a pre-farming population. A people still tethered to wild rivers and mountain valleys. And somehow, their blood flows strong in South India. How? The evidence lies in dust and bone. At Sarazm, a Neolithic site in Tajikistan, archaeologists unearthed polished shell bangles traced geochemically to India's Gujarat coast. Thousands of years ago, long before the Silk Road, these highland tribes were already reaching out, bartering, blending. And they weren't just trading objects. They were exchanging genes. The Iranian-related ancestry entered India slowly, quietly, over millennia, long before agriculture reached Tamilakam. It mingled with local hunter-gatherers, forming the hybrid populations we now see in both the Indus Valley and the Deep South. But that's the irony. This farming lineage came before farming. Its DNA outpaced the very technology it would later be associated with. And in the South, this ancestry didn't just survive. It mutated. Integrated into coastal lineages like the Nair, Bunt, and Thiya, leaving behind genetic echoes tied not just to Iran, but to the Baloch, the Sindhi, the ancient lords of the northwestern frontier. We thought farming spread ideas. What if it spreads to people first? What if the soil of the South was already fertile not with grain but with contact, trade, and adaptation? Because while the world was busy tracing plow marks in the north, one city in Tamil Nadu, far from the Indus, far from the textbooks, was already rising from red earth. Its name? Kijati. And its silence was about to end. Kijati. For decades, it was just a name in Sangam poems, a whisper buried in ancient verses, dismissed by scholars as metaphor, until the soil opened and began to speak. What they found wasn't a village. It wasn't a tribal outpost. It was a city, laid in brick, carved with purpose, engineered with intellect, and dated back to the 6th century BCE. That's before Buddha, before Ashoka, before any script had been found in South India. Until now. Because what emerged at Kijati was more than just walls and drains. They found dice just like those sung about in Kalathogai. They found Tamil Brahmi inscriptions on pottery, pushing the script's origins centuries earlier. They found evidence of industries, textile, dyeing, metallurgy, jewelry, even leisure. A civilization that didn't just exist, it thrived. But here's the contradiction. In schoolbooks, India's second urbanization was always shown as a northern rebirth centered on the Gangetic Plains. Kijati breaks that narrative wide open. It proves the South evolved in parallel, not later, not beneath. Equal. But equality isn't always convenient, because as Kijati rose from the earth, politics descended on it. The Tamil Nadu state government called it proof of an ancient, literate Tamil civilization, indigenous, urban, and proud. The Union government tried to delay the carbon dating, transferred the lead archaeologist, called the findings exaggerated. Because when history shifts power, it shakes identities. And this wasn't just a dig site anymore. It was a fault line between regional pride and national control, between science and silence. But even under pressure, Kijati kept giving. Its burials, its ruins, its language, and now, its DNA. Because as labs began to test the ancient bones unearthed in nearby Kondagai, a new question emerged. What if this southern city also preserved the DNA of its poets? And what if those genes are still alive? But while Kijati whispered its secrets in southern red soil, another skeleton over 1,000 miles to the north shouted something no one wanted to hear. She was found in Rakhigarhi, Haryana, 4,500 years old. Her bones came from the beating heart of the Indus Valley civilization, one of the oldest urban cultures on Earth. But it wasn't her city that shocked scientists. It was her ancestry. When geneticists finally sequenced her DNA labeled I-6113, they found no trace of steppe ancestry. None. Instead, her lineage showed a mix of ancient Iranian ancestry and Southeast Asian hunter-gatherer blood, a blend but not the one that matches what flows through most Indians today. Because modern Indians carry between 5 to 30% steppe DNA, especially those in the north and west. The same genetic signature tied to the Yamnaya people, steppe pastoralists from Central Asia, believed to have brought Sanskrit, horses, chariots. But if the steppe people never touched Rakhigarhi, if the Indus elite carried 0 of their DNA, then the question hits hard. When did they arrive? Because that means something happened after the Indus fell. A new wave of people. New gods. New rules. This wasn't just a migration. It was a genetic pivot point. A turning in blood, in language, in memory. And this is where science stopped being science and started a war. Because to say the Aryans came from the outside, to say they migrated, is to challenge a national story many refuse to let go. The indigenous Aryan theory claims the opposite, that Indo-European languages and Vedic culture began inside India, not imported, but born here. And so Rakhigarhi, a tiny fragment of bone, became a battlefield. Not over land, but over identity. Not over empires, but over who we say we are. And in this war of timelines and tribes, one genetic signature stood waiting in the wings, one that would redraw the map of India's soul. And it came from the steppe. But the steppe didn't arrive like a tsunami. It didn't flood the subcontinent in a single wave. It bled in slowly and left behind something even more powerful than conquest. A gradient, not a line, not a wall. A cline, a slow genetic slope stretching from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, from mountain herders to jungle foragers. At one end, the ancestral North Indians, or ANI, carrying more steppe ancestry, closer to Central Asians, Middle Easterners, even Europeans. At the other end, the ancestral South Indians, or ASI, deeper in AASI roots, closer to the first hunter-gatherers who walked this land. But here's the shock. That cline isn't ancient. It's still alive, mapped not in myth but in blood. Upper caste groups often show 60, even 70% ANI ancestry. Tribal groups in the South, sometimes less than 20. Language lines, caste lines, clan lines, all now reflected under a microscope. But the break didn't happen thousands of years ago. It sharpened only 600 to 1,000 years back when endogamy took hold. People stopped marrying across caste, stopped blending, and the mixing that had shaped Indian genetics for millennia suddenly froze. The result? A society split not just by belief, but by DNA. Some communities now carry extremely rare mutations, founder effects, homozygosity, increased risks, but also a powerful scientific gift. Because these isolated gene pools are now helping doctors trace disease variants more precisely than anywhere else on Earth. India became a paradox. Genetically fractured, yet medically invaluable. Divided by identity, but united by biological code. And across every state, the maps began to glow. Heat signatures of ancestry. Color-coded trails of history. But amidst this ordered chaos, one zone flickered differently. One region, coastal, ancient, layered, didn't fit the model. It refused to follow the rules. Because on the shores of the Arabian Sea, a corridor had opened. And what flowed through it wasn't just blood. It was commerce, and strangers, and foreign DNA. This is where the story breaks wide open. Because while caste lines froze inland, the coast didn't play by the rules. Along the lush monsoon-soaked stretch of Konkan and Malabar, DNA started behaving strangely. Geneticists studying elite groups like the Nair, Bunt, Theya, even Hoysala clans expected to find standard South Indian ancestry, mostly ASI. But what they found shimmered with something else. A Middle Eastern signature. Deep, unexpected, and consistent. Traces linked not just to Iran or Mesopotamia, but to Balochi, Pathan, and Sindhi populations. High genetic affinity with groups far up the subcontinent, and even further beyond. But how did that ancestry reach Kerala? The clues lie not in swords but in ships. These weren't invaders. They were traders. Arab sailors, Persian merchants, Roman diplomats, sailing down from the Red Sea, the Gulf, the Tigris anchoring at ports now forgotten by textbooks. And with them came something more intimate than cargo: mothers. Because when scientists mapped the mitochondrial DNA passed only through women, they found West Eurasian haplogroups: HV, T1A9, U1. Lineages from Arabia, Persia, the Levant, carried not by conquerors, but by wives, by companions, by silent matriarchs who crossed oceans and raised children on foreign sands. It wasn't just gene flow. It was female-mediated admixture. A story of matrilineal migration etched into the very bones of South Indian identity. In communities where women owned property, where family lines passed through daughters, the ocean didn't divide. It stitched worlds together. And slowly, over centuries, a unique genetic corridor formed not from armies, but from love, labor, and legacy. One where West Asian blood fused with ancient Tamil soul, where genes passed through temple dancers and warrior queens, and left behind something the textbooks never predicted. But this wasn't the end of the sea's story, because just down that coast, one ancient harbor held wine jars from Rome, coins from Egypt, inscriptions in Greek, and inside its graves, people who looked nothing like the land they were buried in. Because what came next was a port more Mediterranean than Indian. That port was Patanam, a quiet patch near modern-day Kochi, where the Periyar River meets the Arabian Sea. But 2,000 years ago, it was a storm of languages, of spices, of strangers. And beneath its soil lay the bones of a world the textbooks still don't dare describe. Archaeologists had expected pottery. They found amphorae, Roman wine jars, perfectly preserved. They expected beads. They found glassware blown in the Levant. They expected coins. They found Roman ore, with Caesar's face glinting under Kerala's monsoon sky. But then, they found the bodies. In burial pits dated between the 3rd century BCE and 1st century CE, they found skeletons, some with DNA markers not native to India at all. Haplogroups like J, 2, HV, and T, typically found across Greece, Anatolia, and North Africa, now sitting quietly in the bones of a coastal settlement in South India. One male, his mitochondrial lineage traced to the eastern Mediterranean. Another, a woman, genetically closer to Cyprus than Tamilakam. They weren't visitors. They were buried here, with local ornaments, Tamil-style urns, even Brahmi-inscribed shards next to their remains. Because Patanam wasn't a colony. It was a convergence point. A Roman sailor, a Tamil merchant, a Nabatean trader, all dining, drinking, and dying in the same port. Multicultural, multigenomic, multilingual, and yet woven into one coastal heartbeat. This is the Muziris described in Greco-Roman texts, the port that Pepper built. The reason Pliny the Elder complained that Rome was draining its gold into the east, the very edge of the world, according to Ptolemy. But for the Tamil world, it was the center, a place where scripts met Tamil Brahmi etched into pots, beside Latin seals and Egyptian amulets. A city with no conquerors, just conversation traded in cinnamon, in faith, in skin. But if genes from the Mediterranean arrived here, if Rome left its blood in India's southern coast, where else did South Indian DNA go? What trails did our genes leave behind? Across oceans. We always imagined history as a one-way river, flowing from the empires of the West into the rest. But the genome tells a different story. Because now, scientists have traced South Indian DNA not just inward, but outward. Into the islands of Southeast Asia. Into royal tombs in Cambodia, merchant lineages in Malaysia, coastal communities in Vietnam, and even the highland tribes of Thailand. And in all of them, they found echoes of us. Admixture signals from southern Dravidian populations, from Tamils, from Keralites, from the genetic fingerprints left by early Indian navigators, missionaries, traders, and yes, poets. This wasn't an empire of conquest. It was an empire of connection. a genetic feedback loop carried by maritime trade, by spice routes, by monk caravans and merchant guilds. Between 200 BCE and 1200 CE, India didn't just import ideas, it exported identities. Tamil Brahmi inscriptions in Thailand, granite lingams in Mysore, Vietnam, Pallava-style temples dotting the Mekong. But the twist? This movement wasn't just cultural. It was biological. Children born of Tamil mothers and Javanese fathers. Marriages between Kerala spice traders and Khmer aristocrats. And now, their DNA remains like coral reefs under the ocean. Fragments of India, still living in foreign blood. Because Angkor Wat wasn't built in a vacuum. It was shaped, in part, by artisans who once chanted in ancient Tamil. Because of Java's stone temples, hold carvings whose language has roots in the Sangam age. And suddenly the map flips. History didn't flow from north to south. It pulsed in every direction, from temple shores to rainforest palaces, from Pattanam to Pagan, from Tamilakam to the South China Sea. But if so much has moved, so much mixed, so much survived, then one question remains unanswered, the deepest question of all. Who were we before we were divided? Maybe the better question is, were we ever truly separate? Because when scientists began to compare genomes across castes, across tribes, across languages and time, a strange truth began to rise, like a tide that had always been there. There is no such thing as a pure people. Not in India. Not anywhere. Every population ever studied from Brahmin to Bhil, Rajput to Reddy, Jain to Jaitov carries within it the whispers of migration, of intermarriage, of collision. Even the most isolated communities, the endogamous, the ritually separate, the socially sealed show shared DNA segments with groups they claimed to have never touched. Because history didn't obey rules. It happened in dark corners, in forest clearings, in ports and temples and battlefield camps. Every identity we hold, every surname, every ritual, every claimed lineage is a layered invention, built on movement, on survival, on the blood of strangers. Even the AASI, the so-called First Indians, not untouched. They too carry fragments of earlier beings. Neanderthals, Denisovans, ancient Iranian hunter-gatherers. Purity is a myth. But the idea of purity, that has power. It built kingdoms, justified caste, wrote laws, burned books. But science doesn't care for politics. It looks into the bone and tells the truth. And what the truth reveals is this. The priest, the weaver, the soldier, the outcast all share strands. A fisherman's daughter in Kerala might carry the same mitochondrial tag as a warrior's son in Uttar Pradesh. A tribal tattoo in Odisha echoes the same genome that once danced in the courts of Chola kings. Because this land didn't divide itself. We did. We drew lines where none existed. But now, the genome is erasing them, one sequence at a time. And in its silence, it asks us something we're still not ready to answer. If no one is pure, then who gets to own the past? Maybe the answer doesn't lie in bloodlines, but in the fragments within them, because somewhere between the ancient bones of Tamil Nadu and the digital code of modern genomes, scientists stumbled upon something no one expected. South India holds the highest diversity of archaic hominin DNA found anywhere in the world. Let that sink in. More than Europe. More than Central Asia. More than even the Denisova caves where the mystery began. In certain tribal and coastal populations of South India, Irula, Kurumba, and even Paleyar geneticists have detected deep signals of Denisovan and Neanderthal ancestry, preserved like whispers trapped in amber. These aren't just traces. They're intact segments spanning thousands of base pairs. Longer, richer, and more complete than those found in East Asia or Oceania. Which means this isn't just ancestry. It's an archive. A biological library silently carried for tens of thousands of years by people who were never written into books. Now, for the first time, researchers are using these Indian genomes to rebuild the full Neanderthal and Denisovan blueprints, not from fossils, but from living blood. South India, once dismissed as peripheral, is now the center of deep human memory. Because if the global story of humanity began in Africa, its echoes, its migrations, its experiments may be most visible here, in the genomic dust of a place once ignored. The farther we dig into the soil of identity, the more we find fragments of everyone, hunter and herder, trader and temple builder, and yes, even ancient beings who no longer walk the earth. But some of their code still does. In you, in me, in those who never left these hills. So, what mystery lies in your DNA? Because in the next episode, we follow that trail into the last untouched genome of them all, the lost people of the Andamans.